It's been reported that more than 1.2 billion pounds of pesticides are used annually every day in the United States. Their use exploded in our country after World War II. But the human race has been using pesticides for thousands of years. And if you think you're avoiding pesticides by eating organic food, think again. There are organic pesticides. Hello, I'm Jason Huffman, the editor-in-chief of Food Chemical News. Welcome to the Knife and Fork Show. In addition to publishing food chemical news, our publishing company, Informa, publishes something called Pesticide and Chemical Policy. And we are fortunate to have with us here today one of that publication's star reporters, Chris Knight. Chris, you've been covering pesticides for almost a year now. Mm-hmm. Talk to me a little bit about the regulatory scheme behind pesticides. Who is looking at the pesticides that goes into our food that is grown domestically and imported? How is it regulated?
Okay, I mean, so you have to realize that, pesticides have been used ever since, controlling pests, controlling animals that come and eat your food, insects, fungus. That's been a goal of people ever since they've been growing food. And it ranges from, at the very beginning, it was just oils and soaps they put on food, and now it's developed into some very toxic chemicals that, kill insecticides, and some less toxic ones. So EPA, essentially what happens is they will a company will come to EPA with a bunch of data about how a pesticide works, how it's used on crops, and EPA, under the various statutes that they're dictated by, will look at whether that actually causes a risk to human health and the environment, and they have to basically say it doesn't present an unreasonable risk. And then once EPA sets, it's called a tolerance, it's basically the level of pesticide that can be on a food, then another agency, FDA, and also state agencies step in, and they'll say, they'll basically do tests every once in a while on various crops to make sure that pesticide is not above a certain level. Okay.
Now, when we talk about pesticides, in my head, I think a single chemical. But a pesticide is not necessarily one single chemical, is it?
No, there's about 1,100 active ingredients that EPA regulates in the United States. And it can range from, an insecticide you might see sprayed on crops, the traditional plane, or a tractor spraying stuff, to something that you would use to kill a rodent, or something that you would find in your soaps, like an antibacterial soap, or any disinfectant. So there's a ton of different pesticides there, and basically anything. For every time a registrant, that's the company that makes the pesticide, wants to use their pesticide on a given crop, they have to ask EPA for permission to do that. And every time you do that, you have to do a bunch of studies to back that up. Okay. And so once EPA looks at that data and puts it up for public comment, anyone can come in and say, I don't think that's a good use of that pesticide. Then they would publish it in this big list of federal regulations. And so essentially, anyone can look and find that information. But as you said, there's a huge, variety, a huge number of these different pesticide regulations for every different crop. So, there's one thing that we do, which is the Pesticide Chemical News Guide, which basically assembles all that data.
That's that database that we maintain, that we have another guy keep up for us. Because I think what happens is, if you were watching the Federal Register every day, you could keep a track of every single tolerance level for every single pesticide, but you'd be going back for years to kind of know what particular tolerance level was set for a particular produce item and a particular pesticide. So we keep this thing that used to be in print about that thick, and now is online and searchable. Okay, so one of the things that I know that you're working on now, or have been working on lately, is bees. What's going on with bees?
So I think everyone's heard the news reports about bees in decline, about bees dying around the country. And
colony collapse disorder.
That's correct. One of the, it's a syndrome, a specific syndrome where basically what happens is all the adult bees fly and disappear. They go away from the nest. They don't come back. and what's left behind is ample stores of honey and the queen. And everyone knows that the little worker bees like to defend the queen, so that's not a usual traditional behavior. So people think something's up, and when you talk to any expert, they'll say we think it's a variety of things that are causing this. So you say it could be.
At one point, cell phones were being blamed for this.
Cell phones, that's pretty much fallen out of favor. They also said power lines, I think. Now they think it's a combination of these mites that were introduced a while ago, some fungus, a bunch of different pressures, habitat loss. But one of the emerging things they're saying is pesticides could be to blame. And there's one particular class of pesticides called neonicotinoids, and it sounds just like nicotine.
Yeah.
That's because it's chemically similar to nicotine. And I don't smoke, but I'm told that when you do, you get a bit of a head rush. It feels good. It basically interacts with your neurological system. And
so are these worker bees getting like a nicotine high?
They are getting too much of a nicotine high, and what it causes is paralysis and death. They believe. Ooh. Some scientists believe. So it's supposed to do that for insects. That's the whole point. You want the insects to not be eating your plants that are So the problem is what happened with bees during the planting process. These the neonicotinoids are most traditionally used as a seed treatment. That means that they're applied on the seed before they go in the ground.
Right.
To plant these, you basically you cover it in this insecticide, and then you also put talc or some sort of powder that helps it lubricate. And when you plant it in the ground, some recent studies have found a lot of that talc comes off, and the talc has very high levels of neonicotinoids. And as you've ever seen dust, it gets everywhere. It lands on nearby flowering plants that the bees like to eat.
Right.
It lands in the water. It lands everywhere. Bees can fly through the clouds, and some recent studies have found that the bees die, and they've also found some sublethal effects. Basically, the bees don't die immediately, but it makes them more vulnerable to those other pressures that I talked about earlier, and it also makes them have these erratic behaviors.
This is all theory at this point, correct? Or have we established this is what's happening?
It's an emerging science. So some recent studies that have published in very prominent journals have documented this, but no one's confident about what's happening. And what I've been covering recently is EPA has decided to announce this framework, essentially a plan to evaluate how pesticides affect bees and other pollinators in North America. And essentially what they've done is said, we're going to put pesticides through this tiered screening process. So you have 3 tiers. The first tier is laboratory tests you can control pretty easily. Then it moves to field test. And the field tests are very expensive to do, but basically the pesticide industry says, we're willing to do these tests because we want to make sure, because bees are important. And so this whole week, basically, through Tuesday through Friday, a group of scientific experts has been looking at this framework and saying what parts they think are strong and what parts they think are weak.
Okay, so the EPA will take all of this information back, and what will they ultimately do with it? Will they publish something? Will they put out some kind of a rule? What will happen next?
So, within 90 days, it's called the FIFRA Scientific Advisory Panel.
FIFRA stands for?
The Federal Insecticide, Rodenticide, and Fungicide Act.
That stays in my head for 5 seconds and it's gone.
FIFRA is much easier.
Yeah.
So the FIFRA SAP is what it's called. They're going to finish tomorrow on Friday, and they're going to put their recommendation together in 90 days and give that to EPA, and then it's sort of in EPA's hand. The important thing you have to consider about this is not going to be something that happens in a day. These studies take a long time. A field test is conducted over a whole season, a growing season.
Okay.
The laboratory tests, they have to be developed, they have to be funded. The registrants have to go through all these hurdles. And then once all that data comes back to EPA, then it's going to have to decide how to act.
I want to ask you, we're running out of time, but I want to ask you an important question. If there's this concern about nicotinoids, and there are some people who've established this relationship, why don't we just get rid of them?
So as I said earlier, EPA has to evaluate the costs and the benefits of a given pesticide.
Right.
So if EPA tomorrow said you cannot use any neonicotinoids, the crop industry would say, okay, we're going to use something else. And a lot of those other classes of pesticides are some of the older, more toxic pesticides.
Right.
So you could make things worse.
The thing that I think you told me earlier too was neonicotinoids are used on a heavy amount of corn.
Right. They're used on the majority of the corn plant in the U.S. They're upwards of 90%.
Corn being the most popular product that we grow in the
Right, so
US.
it's planted across the entire country, which is why it's also so concerning.
The ramifications of taking this pesticide away would be major.
It would be significant, I think a lot of people would say. When you talk to people and ask them how much these seed treatments increase productivity of corn and other crops. For corn, it's about 6 bushels per acre. And
6 more bushels per acre thanks to this pesticide.
That's what they say, yes.
Wow.
And it's at a combination of different seed treatments. But essentially, it would be a significant dent in the amount of corn that's produced.
It's a really sticky situation. Well, normally I end the show by sharing the address of our newsletter, foodchemicalnews.com. But in case you want to find out more about what Chris is doing, you got to go to pesticidechemicalpolicy.com. So that's it. I'll see you again soon when we talk to another important food regulatory personality. Thanks for watching.